You won't believe how a quiet lakeside community turned into a battlefield over a fishing pole, a rule book, and a loophole so wide you could sail a pontoon through it. When the HOA tried to wring cash out of me for dropping a line in the water behind my home, I fought back with the one thing they never saw coming, a deed to the lake itself, followed by a chain across their boat ramp and a lesson they'd never forget. If you've ever been bullied by a clipboard and a committee, this is the story you've been waiting for. Before we dive in, a quick ask. If you love HOA takedowns, petty tyrants getting humbled, and neighbor drama that ends with poetic justice, stick around to the end. Hit follow so you don't miss the next saga, tap like if you've ever faced a bogus fine, and share this with someone who needs a win against ridiculous rules. Now let's get into it. It started with an afternoon so calm the air barely moved over the lake behind my house, a mirror of water ringed by tidy lawns and identical mailboxes, each one a small monument to the HOA's thirst for uniformity. I had bought into the development for the view and the promise that nature would outvote nonsense, but the HOA's covenants had a talent for multiplying. And lately, the board's new president seemed determined to turn the place into a theme park of citations. The lake, as I understood it when I closed on my property, was an amenity, not a prison yard, and I had fished there periodically, always with barbless hooks, always catch and release, always leaving no trace but footprints in the dew. That calm afternoon, as the bobber trembled and the line whispered stories beneath the surface, a golf cart appeared, gliding like a beetle over the path, and the board's bright vest flashed through the trees. A notice appeared on my door that evening, couched in officious language, accusing me of unauthorized wildlife extraction, a phrase so absurd it might have been funny if it wasn't attached to a fine larger than my monthly utilities. I combed through the covenants and found the section on lake use, a paragraph thinned by amendments and marginal notes, as if the document itself had been gnawed on by bureaucratic mice. One clause mentioned exclusive control by the association, but nowhere did it say residents couldn't engage in catch-and-release fishing. I sent an appeal, attaching photos of the rules posted on the community board, and received back a form letter that marched, sentence by sentence, toward the conclusion that rules meant whatever the HOA decided they meant today. The more I dug, the stranger it got. The original developer's plat called the lake a detention and aesthetic feature, which meant it existed to hold stormwater and look pretty. But the ownership trail was a mess. Old LLCs, closed P.O. boxes, a transfer that had never properly recorded. It dawned on me that the HOA's exclusive control might be more myth than mandate, and rumors in the neighborhood hinted the developer's dissolved company had left some assets adrift with no clear title. I hired a title researcher, a quiet professional who spoke in terms of chain of title, encumbrances, and clouds, and a week later I held a report that made my hands buzz. The lake, beyond its banks and the sliver of HOA shoreline, appeared to be owned by a shell that had forfeited its corporate status years ago. The water by law needed a steward. Without one, liabilities and responsibilities floated like lily pads with no root. Suddenly a new path revealed itself. The county, reluctant guardian of orphaned parcels, had taken the lake onto its tax rolls when the shell company went belly up. And then, indifferent to its mirror surface and the drama beneath, it had listed the asset for sealed bid disposition. With a mix of disbelief and determination, I assembled a bid that accounted for maintenance, liability insurance, water testing, and the kind of signage that says no without sounding like a snarl. My offer included a management plan to keep the ecosystem balanced, prevent invasive species, and maintain shoreline safety. I sent it in with the steadiness of a cast arcing over water, not knowing if it would find purchase or vanish into the weeds. The HOA, meanwhile, doubled down, sending another fine and a threat of lien, betting that fear and paperwork would herd me back into the corral. But the currents had shifted. Weeks later, a letter arrived, cream-colored and unsmiling, announcing that my bid had been accepted, pending proof of insurance and compliance with local environmental rules. I paid the fees, filed the documents, and watched as a new deed stamped with the county seal lifted from the clerk's tray and linked, at last, to my name. Owning a lake is not a hobbyist's impulse purchase. It is a responsibility with 1,000 moving parts, many of them submerged. I hired a limnologist to test for algae bloom risks, map the inflows and outflows, and set a schedule for aeration. I posted a modest sign at the public-facing access. Private lake, managed use by owner. No HOA authority. The day the board found out, the neighborhood's group chat flared like dry grass under a magnifying glass. They called an emergency meeting, declared my deed invalid in a voice that shook with certainty, and threatened to sue. But as they fanned out across the statutes, they encountered rebar, property law hardened by time and procedure. The HOA had covenants over the common areas and architectural control over the houses, but it did not have dominion over a body of water the developer had failed to convey, especially now that the county had disposed of it through a legal process older than any of us. That weekend, I locked the gate to the boat ramp the HOA had maintained on a sliver of shoreline it did own. The ramp sat like a tongue of concrete licking the water's edge, and for years it had been the board's pride, a symbol of their paternal authority over leisure. With the lock in place, access ended where their deed ended. Boats remained on trailers, paddleboards slumbered upside down like beached beetles, and a hush fell over the lake that was not entirely peaceful. The HOA sent letters frothing with indignation, accusing me of stealing their amenity, but each threatened paragraph collapsed under the weight of the county records I attached in reply. Despite the uproar, I kept fishing minimal, one line at a time, carefully managed and logged, as if piloting a new nature reserve. Neighbors who had rolled their eyes at the board's pettiness now watched me with a mixture of awe and suspicion, wondering whether I was a folk hero or a feudal lord. I did not gloat, but I did not bend either, and that balance drew its own kind of gravity. The first lawsuits arrived like summer storms, loud and short-lived. The HOA claimed the lake was implied common property, that historical use granted them easements without paperwork, that my lock was a public nuisance. I answered with affidavits from the county and the developer's defunct records, pointing out that implied rights cannot conjure deeds and that safety and liability made restricted access a rational choice. The judge, pragmatic and patient, nudged us toward mediation, where the board discovered that righteous anger translates poorly into enforceable terms. Even so, the battle took a toll. I invested in better insurance, learned to speak the language of ecological compliance, and added buoy markers to keep the shallows off limits when the water dipped in late summer. I commissioned a surveyor to pin down the shoreline in high-definition coordinates, removing any ambiguity the board might use to claim incursions. Through it all, the board kept sending violation letters, scolding me for trivialities around my property, as if the fate of the lake could be reversed by citing my trash can placement. The pettiness only strengthened my resolve. The turning point came not with a legal victory, but with a bloom of algae that slicked the cove in August heat, a neon warning that beauty requires stewardship. The HOA had never planned for such events. They had only planned for control. I implemented the mitigation plan I'd submitted with my bid. Aeration pumps, nutrient management, and a schedule of partial drawdowns that relieved pressure on the banks. The water cleared, dragonflies returned to their patrols, and herons resumed their solitary circuits, stepping like elders through the shallows. Nature endorsed the deed more convincingly than any clerk. Word spread beyond the subdivision, and suddenly the HOA's version of events looked shrunken next to the unfolded map of county process, environmental care, and the reality that ownership, when responsibly executed, can improve a place rather than wall it off. Some neighbors approached me quietly to ask about shoreline reeds, about nesting boxes for swallows, about whether they could, under supervision, bring their kids to learn catch and release with barbless hooks the way I did. I built a simple permitting portal, free, with a brief training video on fish handling and a pledge to leave no trace. The lake remained private, but participation widened for those who respected the rules of the place rather than the bluster of a committee. The HOA board, realizing their legal position had evaporated, pivoted to public relations, claiming they had planned all along to work with the lake's owner to ensure responsible use. It would have been funny if it weren't predictable. I offered them something they had never offered me, a narrow, clearly written license for special events, kayak mornings twice a month, supervised by volunteers who completed the same training as everyone else, with liability covered on my policy through a rider funded by their event fees. The board, cornered by reality, accepted. The lock stayed. The rules stayed. The lake, for the first time in years, had boundaries anchored in law and cared for by practice, not posture. In the aftermath, a different kind of document circulated, an amendment to the covenants that acknowledged the lake was not, and never had been, an HOA common area. It required the board to verify ownership before enforcing rules on any parcel beyond the sidewalks and parks explicitly listed on their deeds. It limited fines to amounts that made sense, required photographic evidence for violations, and instituted a transparent appeals process. The bright vests grew less blinding. The golf cart slowed down. The neighborhood rediscovered weekends that didn't start with a scan for infractions. The best revenge, it turned out, wasn't the locked ramp. It was the quiet that returned when authority remembered its limits. Still, status and pride die slowly. The former HOA president, architect of the original fishing fine, retreated into simmering resentment, emerging occasionally to suggest new rules about mailbox flags or the acceptable sheen of driveway sealant. But the community had learned that rules without reason are invitations to revolt, and no one was in the mood for another insurrection. A small committee formed around the lake, not to govern it, but to support its health. Retirees who once fretted over shrub heights now logged water clarity. Teenagers took turns maintaining the trails that ringed the shore. Parents showed younger kids how to cup a fish with wet hands and watch it kick back into the green dark. The HOA had wanted obedience. The lake, oddly enough, inspired stewardship. Through the seasons, I came to understand what I had purchased. Not a weapon, not a trophy, but a responsibility that humbled the part of me tempted to revel in victory. The board had taught me that power wields itself best when it stays small and specific. The lake taught me that places do not become themselves without someone to listen to their needs and respond with care. In winter, when the surface crusted, with a fragile skin that cracked under morning sun, I stood on the bank and felt a peace I hadn't felt since the first day I strung a line into the water. The story had found its end long before the HOA admitted it, and the last pages were written not in court filings, but in sunlight on ripples, and the steady work of neighbors who chose participation over permission. In the quiet, I thought back to that very first fine and the phrase unauthorized wildlife extraction. It sounded now like a punchline to a joke the board had told on itself, a brittle spell broken by a thicker book of facts and a lock whose key jingled in my pocket with the calm of things settled. If you enjoyed watching a petty power trip, meet a brick wall of due process and persistence. Tap like, hit follow, and share this with the one neighbor who always knows what the rules should be for everyone else. Drop a comment with the wildest HOA fine you've ever seen. I'm collecting stories for the next episode, and you won't want to miss how those ones end.